August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal. The darkness is absolute. For a U.S. Marine private behind his heavy machine gun, the world has shrunk to what he can hear. From the far bank of the river there's splashing, then something else, a low, rhythmic chant, growing in volume. The enemy is massing. The private's weapon is aimed not at a person he can see, but at a designated patch of blackness on a sandbar. He cannot miss. The chanting gets closer, the splashing more frantic. His finger rests on the trigger, waiting for the one command that will unleash hell into an enemy he cannot see. This was the Battle of the Tenaru River, the first major land battle for Guadalcanal. On one side, a detachment from the untested 1st Marine Division, isolated on a remote island. On the other, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite unit, veterans of China and Singapore who had never known defeat. The Japanese were masters of night combat. The Marines were fighting in absolute darkness. This raises the central question: how did they win? To understand how they engineered this victory, we must first see just how vulnerable they were. Their vulnerability was absolute. Just 2 weeks earlier, on August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division had stormed ashore with shocking ease, seizing a nearly finished Japanese airfield, the strategic prize of the entire campaign. But their success was short-lived. On the night of August 9th, a Japanese cruiser force annihilated the Allied naval screen in the disastrous Battle of Savo Island. In the aftermath, the American fleet commander, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, made a fateful decision. Fearing for his aircraft carriers, he pulled them back. Without air cover, the transport ships, still half full of the Marines' food, ammunition, and heavy equipment, had no choice but to follow. Overnight, Major General Vandegrift's 11,000 Marines were stranded. They were now an island of defenders on a much larger, hostile island, holding a thin perimeter around the airfield they had just captured. With them, they had just 30 days of rations and a limited supply of ammunition. Every bullet was now precious. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters was acting on dangerously flawed intelligence. They believed the American force on Guadalcanal was a small reconnaissance unit, no more than a few thousand men, who would quickly fold under pressure. The mission to quickly recapture the airfield was given to one of the Imperial Army's most celebrated units, the 28th Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. The first echelon of his force, about 900 elite soldiers, landed east of the Marine perimeter on August 18th. For Ichiki, a veteran who believed in the supremacy of the Japanese fighting spirit, this was not a battle, it was a police action. He decided to attack immediately, without waiting for his main body, confident that a swift, decisive bayonet charge would sweep the timid Americans into the sea. The Marines knew an attack was coming. The real question was from where. The jungle that surrounded their perimeter was a wall of green, a perfect cloak for an approaching enemy. Their survival now depended on finding a clue, any clue, before it was too late. The clue they desperately needed arrived on the morning of August 19th. General Vandegrift ordered a reconnaissance in force to probe east, led by Captain Charles Brush. As Brush's patrol advanced along the coast, they spotted a Japanese reconnaissance party near the village of Koli. Brush quickly set up an ambush. The ensuing firefight was brief and decisive, but the real victory wasn't the skirmish, it was what they recovered. From the enemy dead, they took maps and a diary. From a single wounded officer, they took intelligence. Under interrogation, the pieces snapped into place. The enemy was the elite Ichiki Detachment. Their strength was not a small scouting force, but close to 1,000 men. And most critically, the captured documents showed their exact plan: a direct, frontal assault across the narrow sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River. The vague threat now had a name, a number, and a precise location. The intelligence was a gift, but it was also a death warrant. The Marines knew exactly where the blow would fall. The question was no longer if, but how they could stop it. With the enemy's intentions laid bare, the west bank of the Ilu River, soon to be misidentified as the Tenaru, was transformed into a laboratory of destruction. The task fell to Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. His men had just 2 days. They worked relentlessly, not just digging foxholes, but engineering a kill zone. This wasn't about building a fortress, it was about creating a system. During daylight, machine gun teams crawled out onto the exposed sandbar that separated the river from the sea. They hammered wooden stakes into the ground, measuring and mapping precise fields of fire. Each heavy machine gun was assigned a specific sector that interlocked with its neighbors, creating a crisscrossing web of deadly trajectories. They established what the military calls a final protective line, a pre-aimed stream of grazing fire set to fly waist-high across the entire sandbar. An attacker running through it in the dark would be cut down without ever being seen by the gunner. Artillery officers from the 11th Marines did the same, meticulously pre-registering target grids on the far bank, the sandbar, and the assembly areas beyond. It was a fire-by-numbers system. A single command with a map coordinate would bring down a rain of high explosives on a precise spot, instantly. While the Marines were wiring their trap, Colonel Ichiki was resting his men. He halted his force for a full day, just a few miles from the American perimeter. His own scouts had returned with unsettling reports. The American positions were far stronger than anticipated, lined with barbed wire and machine guns. Ichiki dismissed them. His entire military career, from the battlefields of China to the fall of Singapore, had been built on one unshakable doctrine: the supremacy of Japanese fighting spirit. He was a fervent believer that the aggressive elan of a bayonet charge could shatter any material defense and break the will of a decadent Western enemy. He would not wait for his main force or for artillery support. A swift, silent night attack was all that was needed. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on August 21st, the system was activated. The first wave of Ichiki's force, around 200 men, burst from the jungle, their officers leading with drawn swords, the cries of "Banzai" echoing across the water. They charged directly across the sandbar, straight into the trap. The Marine response was not a panicked volley. It was a cold, mechanical process. On command, the machine guns opened up, firing not at individual soldiers, but along their pre-sighted lanes. The attackers ran headlong into an invisible wall of steel. Simultaneously, pre-registered 75mm howitzers and 81mm mortars began to pound the Japanese assembly areas on the far bank, disrupting and disorienting the follow-on waves before they could even begin their own advance. From the east bank, Colonel Ichiki and his staff watched in stunned disbelief. The volume of fire was impossible. The precision was inhuman. His elite soldiers, men who had never known defeat, were being scythed down in neat rows before they even reached the American wire. They were not being outfought. They were being systematically disassembled by a machine. This wasn't a battle of spirit. It was an industrial process. In a mix of fury and desperation, Ichiki made a fatal error. Refusing to believe his doctrine could fail, he ordered his second, much larger wave, nearly 500 men, to follow the same path, convinced that sheer mass would overwhelm the American line. The second charge met the exact same fate, but on the Marine side, a different kind of battle was being fought, a battle for discipline. The gunners knew their ammunition was finite. They fired in controlled 4 to 5 second bursts, letting their barrels cool, conserving precious rounds. They resisted the instinct to spray wildly into the darkness. Each gunner trusted the man next to him to cover his assigned sector. This was not about individual heroics or marksmanship in the dark. It was about flawlessly executing a pre-planned fire mission, a symphony of coordinated destruction played out on a strip of sand. The frontal assaults were broken, the sandbar silenced, but the battle was far from over. The surviving Japanese soldiers, shocked but not defeated, began to adapt. They abandoned the direct approach, using the darkness to slip into the river itself, probing for a weak point, a gap in the wall of fire. The Marines' rigid, perfectly executed plan had just faced its first test. Now, it was about to face a new, more chaotic one. As Japanese soldiers abandoned the sandbar and tried to wade across the river, they ran into another layer of the system. On the Marine flank, a crew manning a 37mm anti-tank gun was waiting. They weren't firing armor-piercing rounds. They were firing canister shot, turning their cannon into a massive shotgun that tore through the water, devastating the exposed groups of attackers. But the decisive counter came from the sky. On call, 105mm howitzers fired illumination rounds. These star shells burst high overhead, casting a brilliant, temporary daylight over the entire scene. This was the answer. The Marines didn't see in the dark. They periodically created light, freezing the flanking Japanese in a ghostly glare for every rifleman and machine gunner to see. The combination of canister and illumination broke the attack. As dawn approached, the firing subsided. But for the survivors of the Ichiki Detachment, The battle was about to enter its final and most brutal phase. With the first light of dawn, the roles were brutally reversed. The hunters became the hunted. Upstream, unseen, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, had crossed the Ilu River and now swept down, attacking the stunned Japanese survivors from their undefended rear. Simultaneously, the second jaw of the trap slammed shut. A platoon of M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled across the sandbar, the very ground Ichiki's men had failed to take. They plunged into the coconut grove, their machine guns and canister rounds clearing the last pockets of resistance. Caught in a perfect envelopment, the river to their east, the sea to their north, Cresswell's infantry to their south, and the tanks to their west, there was no escape. The systematic destruction of the remaining force was swift and methodical. Realizing the totality of his failure, Colonel Ichiki performed one last act. He burned his regimental colors, the symbol of his unit's honor, and then committed ritual suicide. By mid-morning, the grove was silent. The private behind the machine gun never needed to see his target. His victory, and that of the 1st Marine Division, wasn't a product of luck or superior vision. It was the victory of a system, one built on timely intelligence, battlefield engineering, and the disciplined integration of every weapon at their disposal, from canister shot to star shells. The Battle of the Tenaru shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility in night combat. It offered a brutal but foundational lesson that would become the blueprint for the Pacific War, that meticulous preparation and the cold logic of combined arms could defeat even the most fanatical fighting spirit. The Marines won the battle in the dark not by miraculously learning to see their enemy, but by meticulously engineering a killing machine that made seeing him entirely unnecessary.